I'm Todd Howard, Toddhoward.
And one of the great things about having a fully dynamic game engine is all of this just works.
The game has over 200 dungeons, all handcrafted.
We made a real one.
I was the kid. I was writing games when I was, 12, whatever. And the other kids in the block would say, I'm going to play quarterback for the Cowboys. And I'd be like, I'm going to make video games and everyone's going to play them. You dork. Go back to the chess club. Who's laughing now? Yes, I was in the chess club.
Bethesda didn't just make RPGs. They taught an entire generation what freedom in games looked like. They made worlds players could actually get lost in. They didn't guide you, and they didn't stop you from breaking everything inside of them. The Elder Scrolls and Fallout were synonymous with open worlds so big you'd forget the main quest ever existed. And for years, they had the unconditional trust from a massive, loyal fan base. But there's an uncomfortable question. How did the most trusted RPG studio in gaming go from defining the genre to becoming one of the most divisive studios in the industry? This is the story of how Bethesda spent decades earning our trust and how they lost it in a few short years. Will they ever be back to the peak? Or has their descent into greed corrupted the company? To really understand Bethesda, you have to go back, all the way back to their humble beginnings.
With Starfield. Set hundreds of years in our future, it's an epic about hope.
Christopher Weaver founded Bethesda Softworks in 1986, and for most of the studio's early life, things were modest. Bethesda was honestly just another studio trying to make enough money to keep the lights on. They were years away from massive RPGs. They didn't have that signature style that they're known for. They were just trying to survive. Their first game wasn't The Elder Scrolls. It wasn't Fallout. It wasn't even an RPG. It was a football game called Gridiron. And surprisingly, it did pretty well. Gridiron received generally positive reviews from critics at the time. Writing for the computer game world, Wyatt Lee praised the game's custom playbooks and teams, saying it had tremendous constructability, and pointed out that the statistic-heavy design was something you don't usually see in football simulation games back then. The game sold well too. Well enough that Amiga World later voted it one of the 40 best games of all time. And years later, Christopher Weaver himself would say Gridiron was the game that put Bethesda on the map. Which was important, because without Gridiron, Bethesda probably wouldn't have survived too long. But survive they did. In 1988, Bethesda Softworks published Wayne Gretzky Hockey. Sales of Wayne Gretzky Hockey reached 350,000 units by 1995. And again, put Bethesda Softworks on the gaming map. And Wayne Gretzky Hockey is more important than you think. Because around this time, while Bethesda was still a scrappy studio surviving off sports games and safe releases, a young man would get his hands on a copy of the game. A man who would grow up to become the face of the company's success and the company's failures. During his senior year of college, Todd Howard picked up a copy of Wayne Gretzky Hockey. On Martin Luther King Jr. Day, he walked up to the Bethesda office in Rockville, Maryland and asked for a job. They told him no and he would have to graduate college. After graduating college, he came back and got rejected again. Most people would have moved on. But Todd was different. He didn't move on. He took a job at a smaller studio in Virginia, started going to industry conventions, and took every chance that he got. He kept showing up at Bethesda, asking again and again. And eventually, persistence beat timing. Bethesda hired him, and he started at the bottom, as a junior producer and designer. He watched Bethesda scrape by on practical decisions. He watched safe games keep the lights on. Howard grew up professionally inside that version of Bethesda. Before the identity, before the ambition, and before any risks. And that timing mattered, because not long after he arrived, Bethesda made a decision it hadn't made before. They stopped making the kind of games that were guaranteed to sell, and tried something that very easily could have failed. That decision leads directly into what came next.
Computers are supposed to make life easier. About 1 in 3 American households has bought that theory and purchased a PC. But what they didn't tell you is that life does not get easier right away. For many newcomers, PC stands for pain and confusion. Reed Galen reports.
By the mid-1990s, Bethesda had something they hadn't had before. A direction. Not a brand, not dominance, just a direction. The Elder Scrolls Arena was the first real risk the studio had taken. It was supposed to be small, contained, and relatively easy to manage. Instead, the project kept expanding. More locations, more systems, more freedom. By the time it shipped, Arena wasn't clean or polished, but it was big. Bigger than anything Bethesda had attempted before. Bigger than anything anyone had attempted before. And it sold well. Well enough to justify doing it again. Bethesda was secure, but every project still had to earn its keep. So when they followed Arena with the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, they didn't refine it, they escalated. Daggerfall leaned fully into scale. Procedural generation, hundreds of towns, deep faction systems, character builds that could completely break the game if you knew what you were doing. It was also unstable to the point of infamy. Daggerfall launched in a broken state. Quests failed, saves corrupted, systems contradicted each other, but players didn't abandon it, because no one else was making anything remotely like it. This is the period where Todd Howard learned how Bethesda actually works. Howard wasn't leading the studio yet, but he was deeply involved with the Elder Scrolls projects during this era. He wasn't insulated from the chaos. He was guiding it. Watching what players tolerated, watching what they forgave, taking note of what mattered and what didn't. And one lesson became very clear. Players would accept technical problems if the possibility of adventure was large enough, and that lesson would stick. After Daggerfall, Bethesda nearly collapsed. Financial troubles forced layoffs, restructuring, and a long pause. For a time, it wasn't obvious that the Elder Scrolls, or Bethesda, would continue. When the studio finally stabilized, it came back smaller and more focused. And that comeback was called the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. And Morrowind is where Bethesda became Bethesda. The world was no longer procedural, it was handcrafted. The setting was deliberately strange. The systems were deep and often too opaque to understand, and the game refused to explain itself. There were no quest markers, minimal guidance, and NPCs gave you directions and expected you to remember them. Morrowind trusted the player and punished them for not paying attention. Todd Howard's influence became visible, even if it wasn't flashy. He wasn't pushing Bethesda towards cinematic storytelling. He wasn't simplifying systems. He was reining in the chaos and creating beautiful worlds. Morrowind shows restraint compared to Daggerfall. Systems still exist, but they're curated. The world is smaller, but more intentional. The scope is controlled without losing freedom. And that balance doesn't happen by accident. Morrowind was Bethesda's first critically respected RPG. Not just popular. It proved the studio could take ambition and turn it into something coherent. At the same time, another key figure entered the picture. Pete Hines. Pete Hines joined Bethesda shortly before Morrowind's release, and his role is easy to overlook if you're only looking at game design. But Hines helped define how Bethesda talked about its games, how it framed expectations. Bethesda didn't sell polish, they sold freedom, and it started right here. Hines helped position Bethesda as a studio that embraced scale, player choice, and long-term engagement. Bugs weren't hidden, they were brushed aside, and modding was embraced. Morrowind's success also pulled Bethesda towards a larger audience, whether they intended it to or not. The game sold well on PC, and its Xbox release expanded the studio's reach dramatically. Bethesda was no longer some niche company. They were in the big leagues now. Morrowind didn't just stabilize Bethesda. It positioned them to do something big. By the mid-2000s, the studio wasn't chasing relevance anymore, and it had momentum. And with that momentum came a deliberate decision: widen the audience without abandoning the core idea.
For 65 years, I have ruled this empire. Generals and kings have knelt at my command. But a darkness comes. The blood tide rises.
The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. Oblivion was Bethesda's first true mainstream push. Full voice acting, a more familiar fantasy setting, clearer systems, quest markers, and consoles were no longer an afterthought. They were central to the design. Some of the depth was lost in the process, and long-term fans noticed, but the trade-off was obvious. Oblivion exploded into popularity. For the first time, Bethesda wasn't just respected in RPG circles. They were visible to everyone. And crucially, the game still felt like Bethesda. The bugs were there, the physics broke, NPCs still behaved strangely, but players laughed it off, because the freedom was intact. The balance of accessibility without losing identity is what put Bethesda in a position very few studios will ever reach. So then they did something even riskier. Bethesda acquired the Fallout IP, and with that IP came Fallout 3. The studio applied the Elder Scrolls formula to a completely different franchise. First-person perspective, open world. This was controversial from the start. Fallout had a dedicated fanbase, and Bethesda was changing how the series fundamentally played. Expectations were high, and skepticism was everywhere. But Fallout 3 worked. Decisively. It sold and reviewed well, and proved Bethesda's internal belief was correct. Their design philosophy wasn't tied to fantasy. It could survive a genre shift. This is where Emil Pagliarulo burst onto the scene. Emil's writing approach fit Bethesda's worlds. Broad narratives designed to be experienced out of order. Stories that didn't require strict sequencing to function. Bethesda games weren't about tight narrative control. They were about letting players wander. Fallout 3 locked something into place. Trust. Players expected bugs, they expected rough edges, and they accepted them, because Bethesda could deliver worlds no one else could. And that trust carried forward.
Bop, bop, shoo bop, let's go! Turn up the heat in the wasteland glow. Swing that bat, move those feet. This wasteland boogie's got a crazy beat. Out in the wasteland, the night's alive. With the rads and the ghouls, we'll survive. Grab your partner, don't be shy. Let's boogie till the stars light up the sky. Oh, boogie in the wasteland. Dance away your blues. Shake it up, swing it out. There's no time to...
New Vegas is a special case. It wasn't developed internally at Bethesda, but it used Bethesda's engine, tools, and framework, and in many ways, it showed how strong that foundation actually was. New Vegas leaned harder into role-playing, deeper faction choices, more reactive storytelling, consequences that followed you. And because it was built on Bethesda's systems, it still felt like part of the same lineage. Bethesda didn't need to defend itself. The audience would do that for them. Then, the moment that changed everything. Cultural gaming staple. It stripped the systems down further, smoothed over rough edges, and made the experience more intuitive without abandoning scale. You could play casually or obsessively. You could mod it endlessly. You could ignore the main quest for hundreds of hours and still feel like you were playing the game correctly. Skyrim reached people who had never touched an RPG before. It crossed platforms, it crossed generations. And more importantly, it reinforced the idea that Bethesda could do no wrong. Bugs weren't bugs, they were features. Re-releases weren't questioned, design compromises were justified in hindsight. Bethesda had reached the peak position every studio wants. They weren't just successful, we trusted them. At this point, players didn't want to see if a Bethesda game was good, they assumed it would be. That assumption, more than sales, more than reviews, is what defined the peak of Bethesda. Because once a studio reaches that level of trust, the rules change. And that's where cracks start to show. Skyrim didn't end Bethesda's rise. If anything, it locked them in place. After 2011, Skyrim continued to sell, mods continued to thrive, and new players kept discovering it years after release. So, Bethesda kept releasing it. Legendary Edition, Special Edition, Switch version, Anniversary Edition, you name it. At first, no one cared. Skyrim was still popular, and re-releasing it felt like the best way to keep the game accessible on new hardware. But as the years passed, and there was still no new Elder Scrolls, the re-releases started to feel less like preservation and more like stalling. People didn't turn on Bethesda over this, they just started noticing the pattern. Around the same time, Bethesda introduced the Creation Club. The pitch was careful, curated content, official support, a way for creators to get paid without breaking the game. On paper, it made sense. But the context mattered. Bethesda games had survived and evolved for years, largely because of a free modding community. Mods fixed bugs, expanded systems, and kept the games alive far beyond their launch windows. The relationship had always felt informal, but mutually beneficial. Introducing a paid layer into that space changed the tone. Even when implementation was limited, it made players question where the line was going to be drawn going forward.
Underneath the broken sky, with a tear in my eye, I hold you close, we'll be alright, dancing through the endless night.
Fallout 4 wasn't a failure. It reviewed well and sold extremely well, but it shifted the conversation around Bethesda in a way previous games hadn't. The RPG systems were thinner, dialogue options were reduced and simplified, fans were upset about the addition of a voiced protagonist. Player choice mattered less than it had in earlier Fallout titles. The focus leaned more heavily towards shooting, crafting, and base building mechanics. For some players, that was a welcome change. For others, it felt like Bethesda was sanding down parts of the game that used to make them distinct. It wasn't that Fallout 4 made these changes. It was that Bethesda seemed too comfortable. The studio leaned into accessibility and broader appeal, and then the trade-offs became more visible. None of this broke the trust on its own. But taken together, the constant re-releases of Skyrim, the shift in monetization, and the gradual simplification of RPG systems, it changed how fans engage with Bethesda. People stopped assuming every decision was correct by default, and they started watching more closely. And once that happens, the margin for error shrinks. Bethesda was still successful, still profitable, still widely played, but by that point, the relationship with the audience had changed. Expectations were no longer automatic.
Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah River,
Buggy Mess.
The tension that had been building finally broke with Fallout 76. Fallout 76 wasn't just a risky release. It was a fundamental misread of what people wanted Bethesda to do. An always-online Fallout game with no NPCs at launch, built around multiplayer systems, was already a hard sell. But the state the game launched in made it impossible to defend. The game was unstable, core mechanics didn't work, bugs weren't occasional or funny anymore, they were constant and disruptive. People lost their progress, servers crashed, systems that should have been foundational felt unfinished. More damaging than technical problems was the messaging around it. Bethesda insists the game would evolve, that missing features were intentional, and that updates would eventually deliver the full experience. But at launch, what players had was not an unfinished version, it was an incomplete product. For the first time, the usual defenses didn't work. It'll be fixed later, or stop being reassuring. The expectation that Bethesda games launched rough but improved over time suddenly felt like an excuse instead of a feature. Then, controversies piled up.
Aside from the game having released in an unacceptable state that's unbecoming, even by Bethesda standards, the company has also been facing ire from the community after they pulled a little bait-and-switch deceptive marketing with Fallout 76's Power Armor Edition.
Going forward, now we have a new issue with Bethesda and the Fallout 76 Collector's Edition.
Somebody had sent out a report about this to the Bethesda Gear Help Desk, and they said, "Hello, we are sorry you aren't happy with the bag. The bag shown in the media was a prototype and was too expensive to make." Oh, but if it ended there. No, the reply continues. "We aren't planning on doing anything about it."
Monetization decisions that contradicted earlier promises, customer service issues, physical edition problems. Each one on its own might have been survivable, but together they reinforced the same impression. Bethesda had shipped something before it was ready, and then struggled to control the fallout. To its credit, Fallout 76 eventually improved, NPCs were added, systems were reworked, stability got better, but by then the damage had already been done. The conversation around Bethesda had changed permanently. After Fallout 76, Bethesda went quiet for a long time. Expectations were reset, and attention shifted to one project that was supposed to mark a new beginning.
It's your soul, save me from the night. Sophie, they hope your wish will be eternal.
That project was Starfield. And Starfield wasn't positioned as just another Bethesda game. It was framed as a new universe, a fresh start, and a step forward technologically. A chance to move beyond the constraints that had been building up for years. What players got was something more complicated. Starfield wasn't broken in the same way that Fallout 76 was. It launched in a relatively stable state. But it was boring and dated. Systems that had once felt ambitious were now rigid. Exploration was fragmented, and the sense of seamless discovery that defined earlier Bethesda games was replaced by menus, loading screens, procedural repetition. The scale was there. The cohesion wasn't. The fun wasn't. More importantly, Starfield didn't feel like it was pushing the studio forward. It felt like Bethesda was applying familiar design decisions to a new setting without rethinking the underlying structure. The creation engine showed its age. NPC behavior felt stiff. Player interaction lacked the reactivity people had come to expect from modern RPGs. The response reflected that. Starfield sold well, but enthusiasm dropped off quickly. The modding community had abandoned it. Instead of discussions about discovery and freedom, conversations focused on limitations, missing depth, and how much the game felt like something released years earlier. Together, Fallout 76 and Starfield reframed how people look at Bethesda. The studio that once defined open-world RPGs now felt behind the curve. Whether because they had failed completely or because they no longer set the pace. By this point, Bethesda wasn't being compared to its peers. It was being compared to its past.
That you feel that you accomplished something that week. The people who love video games can always say, like, you know, what'd you do today? I saved the world.
Bethesda didn't decline because it lost talent or stopped caring. The problems were with the structure, and they slowly built up over time. As the studio grew, it became harder to change direction. So why did this happen? The team that made Morrowind and Oblivion operated with far fewer people and fewer dependencies. Decisions were faster, systems were easier to replace, and mistakes were cheaper to fix. By the time Bethesda reached the Skyrim era, it was a much larger organization with more layers of approval and far more inertia. At that size, replacing core technology or rethinking design philosophy became risky and expensive. So studios tend to work around problems instead of removing them. That led to the engine issues. Bethesda stayed committed to the creation engine long after its limits were clear. Each new game adding more systems on top of already aging foundations. Instead of rebuilding, the studio focused on modifying and extending what it already had. That approach kept projects moving, but it also constrained what those projects could realistically do. By the time Starfield released, many of its design limitations weren't creative choices so much as they were technical ones. But leadership also played a role. Todd Howard had guided Bethesda through its most successful years, and the design assumptions that worked during the rise remained largely unchanged. The belief that players would forgive technical roughness in exchange for scale and freedom had been proven true for a long time. The problem was that the industry moved on while Bethesda kept on designing for an audience that no longer existed in the same way. Criticism increasingly pointed to outdated systems and shallow reactivity, but those concerns were often treated as preference differences rather than signs that the formula itself needed revision.
Let's say, okay, we're going to write the great American novel. It's going to be this thick. And on every page will be written comedy and tragedy, and it'll be wonderful, it'll be amazing. And you're going to give this book, this great American novel, to the player. And what are they going to do with it? They're going to rip out every page and make paper airplanes out of them. And they're going to throw them around the room.
Narrative design also stagnated for similar reasons. Emil Pagliarulo's approach for writing fit Bethesda's structure. Stories that could be experienced in fragments, minimal reactivity, and dialogue that supported exploration rather than drove it. That style wasn't inherently bad, but it didn't evolve as RPG standards changed. As other studios pushed deeper choice and consequence systems, Bethesda's writing began to feel static by comparison. Over time, that gap became more and more noticeable.
I first want to ask about this. How will these ZeniMax assets help you with this latest Xbox launch, your Game Pass momentum, and xCloud?
Yeah, I mean, gamers love great games.
The acquisition by Microsoft didn't meaningfully change this trajectory. There was an expectation that the new ownership would force modernization, but Bethesda largely continued operating as it had before. The studio gained more resources and longer development timelines, but its core processes and assumptions remained intact. That meant the same issues persisted, only at a larger scale. Taken together, these factors explain what happened. Bethesda didn't suddenly fail. It became slower to adapt. The studio kept using methods that once worked, even as the conditions that made them successful disappeared. By the time players noticed, the gap between Bethesda and the rest of the industry was already wide.
I think the impact of the show on Fallout as a franchise has been bigger than I expected.
Bethesda is not a dead studio. That's the first thing worth saying plainly. Despite everything that's happened, Bethesda still has advantages most studios never get. They have experience shipping massive open-world RPGs. They have institutional knowledge built over decades, and they still have one of the most recognizable fantasy RPG franchises ever made. The question isn't whether Bethesda can make another successful game. It's whether they're willing to change how they make it. For most people, The Elder Scrolls 6 is their last chance. It doesn't need to reinvent RPGs. It needs to show us that Bethesda understands where they lost people. That doesn't mean chasing trends or copying other studios. It means addressing the issues that have repeatedly been pointed out and repeatedly avoided. Modernizing core systems, improving reactivity, accepting that scale alone is no longer enough, and being honest about what their technology can and can't support. Todd Howard isn't the villain of this story. He's instrumental in Bethesda's rise, and many of the decisions that people now criticize were reasonable at the time that they were made. The problem wasn't that those choices were wrong, it's that they were never revisited. If Bethesda recovers, it will be because leadership accepts that the studio's past success no longer guarantees future relevance. That requires uncomfortable self-assessment. The Microsoft acquisition does provide one genuine opportunity. Bethesda no longer has to rush to release to survive. The pressure to ship unfinished ideas should, in theory, be lower than it has ever been. That only matters if the time is used to rethink fundamentals instead of reinforcing habits. There are some reasons for cautious optimism. Bethesda has acknowledged some past mistakes. Fallout 76 was eventually supported rather than abandoned. Starfield, despite its issues, showed a willingness to experiment structurally, even if the execution didn't land. But goodwill isn't infinite. The Elder Scrolls 6 doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to show that Bethesda understands what people want, what their fans want. It needs to show that Bethesda understands why people stopped defending them, and that those concerns weren't dismissed internally. If that happens, Bethesda can recover. not to an untouchable position they once held, but to something more sustainable. A studio that leads through strong ideas and momentum. And that's why a lot of people are still rooting for them. Not because of nostalgia, but because when Bethesda is at its best, the industry is better for it. Bethesda taught an entire generation what freedom in RPGs looks like. The only question left is whether they're willing to relearn it for themselves. Hey everyone, this is Aaron with the Large Lads, and I hope you appreciated that video. It took a lot of time to make, and that was my first long-form documentary-style video, and no way was it meant to kind of hate on Bethesda at all. I'm a huge fan. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing, and then the best way to support us is to wishlist our game Winter Reach Emporium that's down in the description. Thanks everyone.